Hey everybody, welcome back to the Behavior Revolution. It's that time of year again, the latter feasts, the Feast of Tabernacles, and so there's not a lot of understanding in the body about this special Feast of Tabernacles. There's a lot of understanding about Passover and about Pentecost that's been dealt with over and over again, and we'll probably deal with it again soon. But right now I want to dive into probably what will end up being a 6-part series about Yahusha's tabernacles. And of course, tabernacles referring to the whole season, just like Passover refers to the whole season, whether it be talking about the blood of the lamb, the unleavened bread, the first fruits, all of it. It's all incorporated in the feast of Passover. Well, just here we've got trumpets, we've got the Day of Atonement, we've got the Day of Tabernacles, or booths, some people call it. So we've got all these feast days, 4 actually, in the next month or so, all encapsulated in this term of tabernacles, the feast season. All right, so let's get into it. This is more of an overview, this first episode, about what we're going to go into, and then our next episode will be dealing with trumpets. Let's go. First episode here in Yahusha's tabernacles is called The Experience. The Experience. So what's the experience of tabernacles all about? Let's have a look. Today we start a series looking at the third and final and most marvelous of Yahusha's appointed times and seasons, the Feast of Tabernacles, often called booths or Sukkot in Hebrew. It's a feast which Yahusha's people seem to know or understand very little about, and it will be found that this feast is alluded to in the major and minor prophets more than all the other feasts combined. More than all the other feasts combined. It was, for Yisrael, the consummation of the sacred year. The consummation of the sacred year. And it was the feast of all feasts, as far as the Hebrew mind was concerned. We're going to go into the sacred year and the civil year a bit later. But this was a big deal, this feast. They were waiting for it almost all year. So we've got our chart here. This chart is different from every other chart I've seen in that it actually puts the high Shabbaths in order. A lot of people have all different other days or feasts on these. Some of them put it on a menorah. This is very different because Passover has 2 high Shabbaths. Then there's a high Shabbath for Pentecost. And then there's about 3 months of nothing. And then we come into the first high Shabbath of trumpets. So this whole season here, trumpets, atonement, and first and second booths, this whole season here is called tabernacles. Yeah, the season of tabernacles. And as I said, in our next episode, we're going to deal with episode 2 will be trumpets, episode 3 will be atonement, episode 4 will be booths, and the last 2 will be dealing with other aspects of the feast as well. So you've got your feasts chart here. You can blow this up and have a look at it more in depth. We've got other videos which are going to be linked at the bottom of this page if you want to look at other videos to do with this chart. But you've got your shadows. You've got all the things that tradition says you must do, which we mustn't do. And then you've got the fulfillment of these shadows down here. So between Pentecost and Tabernacles, there was an interval of time between Pentecost here, which is around end of April, May, to trumpets, which is normally around end of September. You've got around about 3 months. Between Pentecost and Tabernacles, there was an interval of time of 3 months. These being the 4th, 5th, and 6th month. Passover and Pentecost were linked together by just a few weeks. Passover and Pentecost were linked together by just a few weeks. 50 days, actually. But Tabernacles stood alone at the end of the sacred year, separated from the previous feasts by several months. These months were dry months. Remember, we're talking harvest, agricultural, crops, farming. So these months were dry months, when generally no rain fell. There were no set-apart gatherings either, for the nation to meet before Yahuah and his sanctuary. So there is definite significance in the time lapse between Pentecost and Tabernacles. There's definite significance in the time lapse between Pentecost and Tabernacles, the dry months. Hence, this Feast of Tabernacles is generally recognized as the Feast of Prophecy. That is, a feast which has yet to find complete physical fulfillment in Yahusha. It hasn't found its full physical fulfillment. There's bits and pieces of fulfillment that Yahusha did and that he's done in his assembly, his bridal fellowship, but not fully fulfilled this season of tabernacles. In Yisrael, none could experience, this is all about experience this episode, remember? The experience of the feasts. In Yisrael, none could experience tabernacles without Pentecost. And none could experience Pentecost without Passover. All must follow Yahuah's order in the feasts according to their respective months. No one could experience the last feast without partaking of the first feast. Understand that? Now I'm just using very plain, simple English for all these terms. I'm not calling Passover Pesach. I'm not calling Pentecost Shabuoth. I'm not calling booths, Sukkoth, or anything like that. I'm not using any Hebrew words, all right? I'm keeping it English. I'm keeping it simple so that you can understand it yourself. Tell your family about it so they can understand it without having to learn a second language, Hebrew. And so if you want to tell anybody else about this too, it's easy. It's in English, all right? We all know it all comes from Hebrew, all right? It's all done. We know Hebrew is the original inspired language. No argument there. But we've got to live today in the 21st century and we speak English. Most of us do. So let's keep this simple, all right? So before you start picking out all the words here going, that's not what it was originally called. We know that, but let's get on with it. So, no one could experience tabernacles without Pentecost or Pentecost without Passover. You had to go in a specific order. All must follow the Yahuah's order according to the respective months. No one could experience the feast without partaking. No one could experience the last feast without experiencing the first feast. Make sense? This will all make sense in a moment as far as Yisrael's wanderings. Likewise, all must know Yahusha as their deliverer and experience him as the Passover lamb. Got this? Can't get to tabernacles if you don't know Yahusha. People think they can. Religion tells you can do whatever you want, but we know you can't even have anything to do with this experience, the real experience, unless you know Yahusha as your Passover lamb. Passover is the first feast. So you have to know him as your Passover lamb before you can experience Pentecost and have his blood. What's the significance of Pentecost? To have his blood covenant written on their new hearts by a set-apart spirit. And only then can they proceed on in Yahusha to experience the truth of tabernacles maturity. So tabernacles, at this point of our study, is going to represent maturity, because it's the maturing of the wheat, the crop, the harvest, right before the harvest happens, yeah? So the harvest hasn't quite happened yet, but the crop is ready. So tabernacle speaks about maturity. You can't have any maturity in Yahusha if you haven't experienced the Passover or the Pentecost experience, as I just expressed in this paragraph here. This is both true. This is true for both Jew and Gentile. For there can be no feast outside of Yahusha. For everything spoken, shadowed, and prophesied in Scripture finds its life, meaning, and fulfillment in him. Makes sense? So it's all about an experience where you know Yahusha is your Passover. You have a new heart, a new spirit written, and his words, living words written on your heart. The same living words that were written on stone at Mount Sinai, which is when Pentecost happened. And around about almost 2,000 years later, the Spirit was written. The Spirit came on them, infilled them. and made this a real, they were living dwellings, living temples. So let's get on with it, yeah? The feast unfulfilled in Yisrael's wanderings. The Feast of Tabernacles was unfulfilled in Yisrael's wanderings. Paul tells us that many of the things which happened to Yisrael were for types and examples to the new blood covenant fellowship of believers. Yep. One of the most remarkable historical types in Yisrael's history is that which pertains to the feasts of Yahuah. Let's first look at A, natural Yisrael, the historical type and shadow. Remember, a shadow is meant to lead us to the foot of Yahusha. If you're not at the foot of Yahusha by following a shadow, then you're following some gobbledygook, ridiculous system. Everything is about Yahusha. Yisrael experienced the feast of Passover in Egypt and the mighty deliverance which resulted there. They understood the concept of the blood and the unleavened bread in their separation from the land of bondage through immersion into the Red Sea and the cloud. The journey brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai, where the nation experienced the Feast of Pentecost in the 3rd month. Yahuwah's intention, this was really good. Yahuwah's intention was then to bring Israel into the promised land of Canaan, where they could enter into the 3rd and final Feast of Tabernacles and partake of the fruit of the land. Because it's all about the fruit of the harvest. That was Yahuwah's plan. Passover, Pentecost, and then cross over into Canaan to experience tabernacles. In Egypt, they knew the Passover lamb, the blood and the unleavened bread. At Mount Sinai, they experienced the marriage covenant at Pentecost. But only in Canaan could they know and enjoy tabernacles. The great tragedy is seen when the nation came to Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh means set apart or perfected, and Barnea means an inconstant or fickle sun. Inconstant or fickle sun. Fickle just means you just respond to every whim. 1 minute you're this, 1 minute you're that. You're fickle. You're here. Got no roots. You're just led by your emotions, tossed and turned. You're fickle. Can't make up your mind, and when you do, you change it straight away. You're just all over the shop. So, Kadesh means set apart, and Barnea means inconstant, fickle sun. It was at Kadesh Barnea that Yahuwah's chosen son, Yisrael, rejected the land promised to his fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in rejecting the land of Canaan, he also rejected the greatest feast, the Feast of Tabernacles. That was when the spies were sent out, remember? Joshua and Caleb came back. There was all this bitching and moaning about it, and Moses chucked a fit. And, anyway, for 40 years, Yahuah allowed Yisrael to wander in the wilderness until all that generation died out. They rejected him, so he rejected them for a time. Here you go wandering for 40 years until all that generation. That's a lot of people. There were over 3 million people, and all of them but 2, had died out from the older generation anyway. Anybody over 20 who left Egypt had died out. Except only Joshua and Caleb lived to enter into the land of Canaan with the new generation. The national sin was that of unbelief. Imagine going through all this. This is one of my favorite pictures. Look at it. Amazing. Going through all this experience and being killed off in the wilderness because you rejected Yahuah. It is evident that the new generation, after crossing the Jordan, kept the feasts of Yahuah. So the new generation experienced Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Joshua and Caleb, as overcomers, also enjoyed the feast of Yahuah in Canaan land at the end of the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They had a restoration of spirit and wholly followed Yahuah. What about this? Amazing. It's all about the new generation and the experience that there is to have. Now let's come to spiritual Yisrael. Some people don't like that term, but it's really what it is. The new blood covenant. The historical fulfillment. We just looked at the shadow of Yisrael. Now let's look at the historical fulfillment. The old blood covenant scene may be superimposed upon the history of the new blood covenant fellowship in remarkable comparison. What? The old blood covenant can be superimposed on top of the new blood covenant in comparison. The historical books of the new blood covenant writers, New Testament, shows the fulfillment of the first two feasts. Got that? New Testament shows us the fulfillment of the first two feasts. Where? Well, the four Gospels present Yahusha as the historical fulfillment of the Feast of Passover and the sheaf of first fruits. We saw that. In his body, he was the Passover lamb, and he was the sheaf of first fruits that was waved. He went up into heaven and waved himself. The book of Acts shows remarkably the historical fulfillment of the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, in the fellowship. But where in the history of New Covenant Israel can one find the fulfillment of the third and final feast, the Feast of Tabernacles? Where is it? This is the one remaining feast of prophecy. They call it prophecy because it ain't happened yet. This is the one remaining feast of prophecy, the feast not quite fulfilled in the bridal fellowship. As I said, there's been bits of it that have been fulfilled, but not properly. The fact remains that the Feast of Tabernacles is the only shadow in the old blood covenant which has not yet been fully fulfilled. The new blood covenant fellowship follows the pattern of the old blood covenant fellowship. First the natural, then the spiritual. First the type, then the antitype. First the shadow, then the substance. That's why we're looking at all the shadows, the types, what happened in the natural, because it's a blueprint of what's going on in heaven, the other dimension. As natural Yisrael wandered, this was good. As natural Yisrael wandered for 40 years after Passover and Pentecost and failed to enter into tabernacles in Canaan through unbelief, so New Covenant Israel, the bridal fellowship, has followed suit and has been wandering, so to speak, through history in so much unbelief of Yahuwah's promises. Generations have passed on, dying in the wilderness, never experiencing Yahusha. How about that? See how it can be superimposed onto human history now? It's not that this third feast is not dealt with in the new blood covenant, for it is. Hebrews and Revelation especially deal with this Feast of Tabernacles and its integral parts. However, Yahuwah has kept this feast for the end time generation, who will fully believe him and enter into his promises. Yahuwah has kept this feast for the end time generation, who will fully believe him, and enter into his promises. The nation of Yisrael wandered for 40 years, and the new covenant fellowship has been wandering for approximately 40 jubilees. There's that number 40. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 jubilees. Now we know that a jubilee is 50 years. So what's 40 times 50 years? About 2,000 years. That's about how long the new covenant fellowship has been wandering around in circles, chasing its own tail. But the wilderness wanderings are ending. A new generation is arising. They are experiencing Yahusha as their Passover lamb, being cleansed in his blood. This is the first time in human history, for the first since the last 20 or 30 years, since somebody can call on the name of Yahusha, because the name was hidden. It was gotten rid of. Yahusha. Nobody knew it until about 20, 30 years ago. That's when it came around, restored. Yahuwah has been restoring his name. So this generation is arising. For the first time in history for the last 2,000 years, they are observing the feast. They are experiencing Yahusha as their Passover lamb, being cleansed in his blood, in his name. They are observing the Feast of Pentecost by guarding Yahuwah's commandments, which are brought to life in a new heart by his set-apart spirit. And they won't stop there, but will move on and experience the maturity of the Feast of Tabernacles and all the truths symbolized there too. This Feast of Tabernacles is all about coming to maturity, the bride coming to maturity right before the harvest. Yeah. Let's talk about now the feast postponed and substituted, because while the bride, the new generation, a small portion of her is being matured, the wise maidens, there's also something else going on under the surface to counteract this experience. The feast postponed and substituted. In 1 Kings 12, we have an interesting account of the division of the United Kingdom of Israel into two kingdoms, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, Ephraim. We're about to go into all this in 1 Kings after Solomon. So we had Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. He took the throne over the house of Judah, consisting of 2 tribes, plus the priestly tribe of Levi. So Rehoboam had those. That's what we call the southern tribes. And then Jeroboam, the son of Nebat and servant of Solomon, took the throne over the house of Israel, consisting of the remaining 10 tribes. So you can see Rehoboam took these, Judah and Benjamin and the Levitical priesthood, and Jeroboam took these tribes up here, the rest of them. Yahuah permitted this division to take place so that his sovereign purposes would be worked out in the nation. Yahuah permitted this. Yahuah permits everything that's going on. He's permitting it so that his sovereign purposes can be worked out in the nation. In the remainder of the chapter, we see how Jeroboam set up a substitute Feast of Tabernacles, postponing it to another month. Not Passover, not Pentecost, Tabernacles. He set up a substitute Feast of Tabernacles, postponing it to another month. Now, as we know, these aren't feasts as such. They are appointed times. Nothing to do with us. It's like Yahuwah's bookkeeping, his Shemitah cycles of 50 years since creation going on. So it's just it's a time. He says at this time, this time, this time, and this time, this time, something's going to happen. So be there at the right place at the right time. The time he's told us, and the place is this set apart place that he's now anointed, this living temple. So right time, right place. It's all about that. So you can't just postpone it. It's his time, you know. His time is that word, cyclical, not linear, cyclical. Anyway, Jeroboam, fearing that the kingdom would return to Rehoboam, decided to set up a counterfeit religion. He had 2 golden calves made, setting them up as deities, even as Aaron had years before. One golden calf was set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. This became a sin among the people, for they began to worship these golden calves, even as they had done under Aaron. And they are there. Brought them into the temple. Jeroboam also set up a house of high places and established his own priesthood, which were not of the tribe of Levi. And then to add to his sin, he established a feast in the 8th month, just like the feast that was in Judah, Tabernacles, which was the 7th month. He built an altar and sacrifices to these false deities on the 15th day of the 8th month. Remember, Satan's always copying, mimicking, counteracting, counterfeiting. The scripture states that this was the month which he had devised of his own heart. And for his sins, Yahuwah sent a prophet to bring judgment upon him. However, Jeroboam did not repent, but went further into sin, as 1 Kings 13 clearly shows. The lesson which can be learnt from this historical account is that just as Jeroboam set up a counterfeit religion and postponed and substituted the Feast of Tabernacles, so will other leaders and movements do likewise. The true Feast of Tabernacles was to be kept in Jerusalem in the place where Yahuah recorded his name, the place that he rested his name on the dwelling place, the temple. It was also to be kept in the 7th month. Now, it's all about the time and space, isn't it? The time and the place. We know when the time is, 15th day of the 7th month. Where is the space? Where is the place? Where is the set-apart place of Jerusalem today? Please don't tell me it's in the Middle East. You wouldn't dare tell me that, would you? Where is Jerusalem today? The place he rests his name on. I don't see anywhere over in the Middle East where Yahuah is celebrated, worshipped, praised. Who's got their name written on their forehead? It's us, the living temples. The place he rests his name on, for only there can this feast be observed. You can't observe this feast unless it's where his name has been rested. Yeah? So what's all the misdirection and buffoonery going on overseas? It's all here. This is where the celebration takes place. Evidently, Jeroboam reasoned in his heart that the people of Judah would probably accept the postponed and substitute feast rather than bothering to go all the way up to Jerusalem. In this way, he believed he would be able to keep the kingdom of Israel from reuniting with the kingdom of Judah. So likewise, there is still a strong force standing in the doorway to stop people from going up to Jerusalem to observe the feasts in sincerity and truth. But all immersed believers in Yahusha's name have direct access to the throne room of the divine Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, where one greater than Solomon sits on the throne in all esteem and authority in the royal city of David. So what's the problem? Why would you let anybody balk you, distract you? Why would you let any carpetbaggers or 𝗪𝗔𝗾 messianic religious teachers hold you back? Go. If you've been immersed in the name of Yahusha, there's a portal there. You can celebrate, you can observe this feast within you. And with anybody, if you got like-minded believers around you, that's great. But what's the problem? There's no problem. Run to Yahusha. The tragedy today is that many believers postpone this feast to some other time, or pass it on to other people, or even have a substitute feast. Now, obviously, substitute feasts could be anything from Christmas, Easter, birthdays, Halloween, all those pagan feasts, but it also means this, a substitute feast, to not focus on Yahusha and his reviving power is to substitute. Instead, we're going to just go and blow air horns and blow ram's horns and do all this kiddie, childish, stupid shadow stuff, not focusing on Yahusha and the fresh, reviving power that he's doing here today, maturing the bride right before the harvest. If you're not focusing on that, you are substituting the feast for something else. And by doing this, the fellowship is robbed of entering into this marvelous feast as Yahuah intended. However, Yahusha will have a people that will indeed enter into all three of his feasts, rather than follow the modern day Jeroboams, the Nimrods, and a counterfeit priesthood in an idolatrous, beastly system of behavior, which is now in the bride also. So we can hold up all the Christmas, Easter, Halloween birthdays and say, oh yes, I'm a 𝗪𝗔𝗾, I don't do any of those feasts. Well, I go out and blow ramps. Oh, please. It's all about the revival. It's all about focusing on Yahusha and the fresh wind, the fresh movement of his spirit that he's doing in these last days. If you're not doing that, you're just in liturgy. You're just in tradition. Jewish, what the Jewish will, what they've done with the scriptures. They've taken it, turned it into a whole Hebrew, roots-minded Jewish will. It's insane. Half it's pagan anyway. Anyway, the Feast of Tabernacles outlined. As I said at the top, this whole section here is considered the season of tabernacles, times and seasons. Passover had three integral parts to it: the blood of the lamb, the unleavened bread, the first fruits. Pentecost then stood alone. There was a little bit of a break, 50 days, then there was Pentecost. And then, after 3 months, Tabernacles had 3 integral parts to it also: trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. Altogether, the 3 feasts equal 7 high feast Shabbat days in their respective months, times, and seasons. And we'll just gloss over this. You can look into these scriptures if you want to go deeper into this study. Leviticus sets out the 3 parts of this feast of the 7th month. The feast day of trumpets there, atonement there, and tabernacles there. Other scriptures dealing with the details of this feast may be found in Numbers 29 and Numbers 10, Leviticus 16 in the Old Blood Covenant, and the book of Hebrews, and also Revelation in the New Blood Covenant. So, the Feast of Tabernacles, historically and prophetically, there has been an historical fulfillment of Passover and also an historical fulfillment of Pentecost, but there has not been an historical fulfillment of Tabernacles. Consistency of interpretation demands that this feast, as the previous 2 have, also find historical fulfillment. Not only must there be an historical fulfillment, there must also be an experiential fulfillment. The historical, symbolical fulfillment pointed to the historical, experiential fulfillment. The symbol points to the experience. The shadow points to Yahusha. As this feast is studied, it will be seen that certain elements in this feast have been fulfilled historically in Yahusha and his work of deliverance. But the full truth shadowed has to find its fulfillment in the experience of the fellowship also. How we behave, how we live it, how we manifest this through our day-to-day lives and behavior. Hence, in studying the details of this final feast, it is necessary to clearly understand and discern that which Yahusha has already fulfilled, and that this has to be fulfilled in the fellowship also. So we have to know what Yahusha has already fulfilled, and we have to understand that this has to be fulfilled in the fellowship also. Or it is important to understand that which is historical and that which is prophetical. What was before and what's coming. This twofold fulfillment should be distinguished, otherwise misunderstanding and misinterpretation will result. Tongue twisters. This will be noted by A, that which has been fulfilled by Yahusha historically and judicially as to its temporal and typical and symbolical elements, and B, that which has to be fulfilled in the fellowship prophetically and experientially as to its eternal and spiritual elements. This twofold fulfillment will be kept in view as we consider the details of this feast, as it involves Yahusha historically and the fellowship, his body, prophetically. It's basically what it's saying is everything that was shadowed in the Old Blood Covenant in Israel has to be fulfilled, not just historically by Yahusha himself in the flesh, but has to be experienced by the bridal fellowship, his body. Yeah? Makes sense? So, the challenge comes to all believers. Here's the challenge. The challenge comes to all believers as to which feast they will stop at, which experience they will stop at. Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles. Remember, just as the tabernacle pointed to the way of approach to Yahusha, to Yahuah, and how we must behave and the experience we must have through repentance, immersion, being clothed in the right garments and the Spirit within us. All those things, same here with these feasts. These feasts were given at the same time as the blueprint for the tabernacle and the 10 Commandments. All these things were given at the same time, and they are an experience. They must be experienced. So the challenge is, where are you going to put your stake in the ground and go, okay, I've had enough now. This is where I'm stopping. I'm just comfortable living out my life in this experience that I've had. I'm happy with the books I've read. I'm happy with the scriptures, understanding that I know. I'm stopping here. Will it be Passover? Can you stop at Passover? Stop at Pentecost? Or go on to Tabernacles, which is ongoing because it hasn't fully been fulfilled. The assembly history shows how Yahuwah's people have stopped at either the first feast or the second feast. Yahusha's bride, wise and foolish, have built their many denominations and 𝗪𝗓𝗏 messianic movements around the various truths of these two feasts, Passover and Pentecost. But then they've allowed the surrounding religions, cultures and traditions to seep into the mixture swill of their worship behaviour. See, if you stop, things start to swill in, seep in. If you stop, things start to happen. If you keep walking around the same paddock, you got no fresh food. You start muddying up you're just walking around in your own poo, really. So you need fresh pastures, you need to go on. And the sad history of the assembly shows that those who experienced Passover truths opposed those who experienced Pentecost truths. And those who experience the Pentecost truths oppose those who seek to follow on to know Yahusha moment by moment in all fullness of portaled tabernacle truth. What could this mean for you? What could this mean for me? We need to go on. We need to go through the experience of Passover, through the experience of Pentecost, and into the experience of Tabernacles, which is an experience of maturity. See? Because if we look at it, we'll look at this chart briefly. If we look at it, Tabernacles, the day of the shout, the trumpets, the day of the covering, atonement, day of the harvest, dwelling in tents, the booths, the tabernacles, and then the last final day of the harvest when it's all finished, the marriage covenant is consummated. These things never really got fulfilled in Israel's history. And if we look here, they haven't been fulfilled yet either. The sun hasn't gone dark yet. The moon hasn't gone blood red. Messiah hasn't returned. We haven't been raised to meet him in the sky. That's trumpets. That's what happens on the day of trumpets, guys. This global air siren, we're going to deal with it in our next episode. The day of trumpets. And then atonement, of course. This hasn't happened. The reapers, the judgment by fire, the alive in Messiah raised, the dead in Messiah raised, and the alive meet him in the sky, yeah, all that. New Jerusalem, haven't seen that. Consummation of the bride, haven't seen that. So this is all unfulfilled. But we're not going to experience it either if we don't mature. So that's why these are called redemptive feasts, feasts of deliverance. Because every year we look back on the last year and we think, I'm not like I was last year. I don't really feel like that anymore. I don't want to do that anymore. So each year it's like Yahusha showing us where he's taking us. By looking back, you can see forward, you can see your path. And our path, of course, is onto maturity. So that's enough for today, guys. That's our introduction. This is an experience. And what's the experience been like coming into this? Stay tuned. I'll be recording another video shortly about the Feast of Trumpets, because that's coming up in a couple of days. Love you guys. See you later.
Check it out. Ain't it funky, man?